Yankee Stadium in New York City. They call it the house that Ruth built with good reason. His mighty bat was the magnet that drew the crowds.
The year was 1927. Babe Ruth thrilled Americans with his 60th home run, and Charles Lindbergh did what no person had done before him. He made a solo crossing of the Atlantic Ocean in a little single-engine aircraft. The world of entertainment was also changing. Metropolis made its official debut in Germany. Buster Keaton enjoyed a smash hit with The General. The first talkie was released, The Jazz Singer, with Al Jolson.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet.
2 history-making banquets were held that year in California. In Los Angeles, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was founded. In San Francisco, a group of lawyers celebrated a new organization to regulate the legal profession, the State Bar of California. Perhaps it was a play of fate that caused these 2 organizations to be founded in the same year. The story of the State Bar would become as melodramatic as any Hollywood movie.
Hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
Hello, I'm Karen Kahn, and I'm here to talk to you about lawyers. We love them, we hate them, but we can't seem to live without them. Lawyers can change our lives for the better, and some can do us harm. We want to unleash them when they work for us, and cage them when they don't. Regulating lawyers has never been an easy task. Lawyers in California are governed by the California State Bar Association, a public corporation under the umbrella of the California Supreme Court. When California Governor C.C. Young signed the State Bar Organization Bill into law, he created an integrated bar, also called a unified bar. This means that the bar helps lawyers and punishes them. It is the hand that feeds and takes away. In order to practice law in the California state courts or give legal advice in regard to California law, a person is required to be a member of the California State Bar. A person is not required to be a member of the California Bar in order to practice in the federal courts or in other states, all of which have their own separate admission and discipline procedures. The State Bar was created to be one of the Supreme Court's administrative arms, but as a public corporation, the bar must be self-supporting and earn its own income without taxpayer support. Most of that income comes from lawyer membership dues, and to a lesser extent from donations and other fees. In the beginning, the bar's founders expressed high ideals.
We are the ministers of justice, and no lawyer is worthy of any reputation in the profession, whatever his ability may be, if he does not regard himself first and last as a minister of justice in the community in which he practices.
But less than 5 years after those noble words were published, the organization began to dehumanize some of its members. The bar promoted an attitude that some lawyers should be thought of almost as vermin.
An unclean lawyer is not only a disgrace to his profession, but a menace to the public at large. He is a nauseous thing and should be relentlessly abated like any other nuisance.
The bar's honeymoon period ended quickly. Many lawyers were beginning to feel that the state bar had become the nauseous thing. An official investigation was launched by State Assemblyman James F. Brennan. Many attorney members weighed in with their opinions.
Rotten because of the political clique that dominates it. I'm very much opposed to the Mussolinis at the head of our bar.
Thousands of dollars gotten from struggling lawyers and blown in on luxury trips by members of Board of Governors.
I think it is a big farce with no benefits.
After many years' observation of the workings of this organization, I am of the opinion that it has accomplished nothing for the lawyer, but has been a useful instrument to advance the interests of the big corporations and selfish interests trying to exploit this state.
In 1935, the legislature passed a bill directing the state bar to conduct a plebiscite of its members. The plebiscite asked a single question: do you favor repeal of the State Bar Act? The very survival of the State Bar was at stake only 8 years after it had been founded. Some lawyers came to its defense.
What's wrong with the California State Bar?
I also disapprove of disgruntled attorney assemblymen trying to gain publicity and further personal ambitions by such an investigation.
I believe the State Bar Act to be a splendid attempt to put shyster lawyers and crooks out of the legal business. It has some faults, no doubt, but these can be remedied.
When the votes were tallied, the plebiscite lost. 5,457 lawyers voted to keep the bar. 1,899 voted to abolish it. The State Bar had just survived its first near-death experience. California continued to grow and develop rapidly. One kind of gold rush was replaced with another. As the population of lawyers grew, complaints against them increased proportionately. Attorney discipline became the main activity of the State Bar, even as it continued to regulate admissions and perform other duties. For decades, attorney discipline cases were assigned to volunteer lawyers, who would make recommendations to the State Bar Board of Governors, with the right of appeal to the California Supreme Court. Many people thought that this volunteer system was effective. But the State Bar was not able to organize the volunteer system well enough to keep up with the growing population. By 1981, the situation had become critical. In May of that year, California's leading newspaper for attorneys, the Los Angeles Daily Journal, ran a 4-part series complaining that the State Bar was not doing enough to discipline bad attorneys. 4 years later, a major newspaper in San Francisco, The Examiner, followed with a 6-part expose. The Examiner covered much of the same ground as the Daily Journal, but this time the stories and lurid graphics caused a political earthquake. The Examiner recognized that California's volunteer system had once been a model for the nation, but the bar was accused of having become lenient, secret, and slow. The Examiner told egregious tales of lawyers who had committed serious misconduct, and even crimes such as drug trafficking, but were only suspended by the State Bar instead of disbarred. The expose revealed that many discipline offenses involved lawyers who had developed drug or alcohol problems. The bar was criticized for being too lenient in those cases. One of the biggest problems cited by the Examiner was the State Bar's large backlog of discipline cases. This was causing prosecution delays that allowed many attorneys to continue practicing law for months or even years after being accused of serious misconduct. The Examiner stories gave many readers the impression that lawyers in California had become generally more dishonest. But the Examiner graphs demonstrated that the number of complaints about lawyers had only increased in the same proportion as the number of lawyers. The Examiner also failed to point out that the secrecy of State Bar discipline proceedings was not so much intended to protect lawyers as it was to protect the clients. Clients could feel safe making complaints about their lawyers without fear that their private matters would be made public. But the overall message that many readers took from the Examiner series was that lawyers are sinister, lawyers are eager to squeeze money from their clients, and some lawyers seem to be the spawn of hell itself. The Examiner suggested that in order for the State Bar to regain its credibility and survive as an institution, the bar needed to disbar more lawyers every year. State Senator Robert Presley created a task force to look into the problem. The task force recommended that the State Bar be stripped of its discipline functions. That would have meant the end of the unified bar. The State Bar had much to fear from Senator Presley. The legislature must approve the annual dues bill, which permits the bar to collect membership fees. Without this yearly approval, the State Bar is not able to collect all of the money it needs to stay afloat, and it would be forced to shut down almost completely. Nearly all bar employees would lose their jobs. In response to these events, the State Bar initiated Get Tough reforms.
The reformed system, according to bar management, is characterized by new severity in punishing offenders, and above all, a new recognition among bar leaders that discipline is the bar's first priority.
New lawyer punishment guidelines were adopted, which are known today as the standards. Critics say that some of the standards were too draconian and pandered to get the lawyer's mob mentality. What most people seem to miss, though, was a statistic shown in California Lawyer magazine at that time. Between 1973 and 1985, the lawyer population had increased 132%, but the number of complaints had only increased 105%. In other words, complaints against attorneys on a per capita basis had dropped. This was a sign that the overall behavior of the lawyer population had actually improved during the previous decade. But it was too late. The monster hunt was not to be stopped. Under the new standards, if a lawyer had a prior record of discipline, then the second punishment must usually be greater than the first, even if the offense is less serious. The Board of Governors added a 3 strikes rule. If a lawyer is disciplined a third time, he or she must usually be disbarred, even if the third offense is relatively minor. A disciplined lawyer would also be required to pay the state bar's reasonable costs of prosecution if the lawyer receives any kind of public discipline. And who would decide what is reasonable? The state bar. The volunteers of the state bar court found themselves under pressure to recommend harsher punishments. But this caused many injustices, and even the California Supreme Court expressed concern in 1987.
This record, like others we are receiving with increasing frequency, leaves material gaps in the analytical path from charges to proof, to findings and conclusions, to recommendations.
That was the Supreme Court's polite way of saying that the State Bar Court was railroading many lawyers on insufficient evidence. In 1987, the State Bar agreed to allow the California Attorney General to appoint an independent discipline monitor. That monitor was Robert Felmuth, one of the original Naders Raiders from the 1960s and 70s, and now a law professor in San Diego. He recommended that the 448 attorney volunteers of the State Bar Court be replaced with less than a dozen full-time judges to hear lawyer discipline cases. The judges' salaries and expenses would be paid by the State Bar, which also paid the prosecutors. And so, the full-time State Bar Court was born. It opened for business on September 1st, 1989. The first presiding judge was Oakland attorney Lisa Pearlman, who was the subject of a glowing profile in the Los Angeles Daily Journal. Not everyone was happy with this new system. Law professor Gert Hirschberg was the last person to preside over the volunteer State Bar Court. In 1989, he began writing a series of columns for the Los Angeles Daily Journal, where he defended the volunteer system that had just been abandoned.
The volunteer system enabled the state bar to obtain the best talent at no expense. To soothe legislative outcries, we have recently multiplied the disciplinary charges many-fold. The disciplined staff is now beating to death the Mickey Mouse cases. The bad ones get away. All of this is being done to present statistics to a legislature.
Professor Hirschberg declared that the State Bar Court had become a monster.
Some of the recent changes should be repulsive to any lawyer. It is not right that the Office of Trial Counsel, the bar prosecutors, should be under the same roof as the State Bar Court. It is not right that a letter sent by a state bar investigator to a suspect attorney should advise him that failure to cooperate can be another basis of discipline, when the attorney is entitled to the full panoply of constitutional protections, such as self-incrimination. It is not right that once a notice to show cause, that is, formal disciplinary charges, is issued, all confidentiality disappears. The new system is a catastrophe, and the good lawyers of California have been irreparably damaged.
Back in Sacramento, Assembly Speaker Willie Brown started pushing back at these trends. He supported a new law in 1990 that made it a misdemeanor to knowingly file a false state bar complaint about an attorney. The problem with this law, critics say, is that the bar is not required to refer false complaints to the district attorney for prosecution. The bar has almost never been known to do so. In 1992, Speaker Brown introduced a bill to abolish the Unified State Bar. He withdrew it when bar president John Siteman agreed to establish a study group called the Commission on the Future of the Legal Profession. The controversy inspired California Lawyer magazine to poll its readers in its October 1992 issue on the question, should the state bar be abolished? The results were surprising.
The state bar is a bureaucratic beast that feeds on us.
The poll revealed that a large majority of lawyers in California disliked the bar. A full 89% said that the state bar should no longer exist as it was then structured, which is the same structure that it still uses today. A majority believe that attorneys should be regulated by a normal state agency like other professions. By an almost 2-to-1 margin, poll respondents favored a mandatory bar for admissions and discipline and a voluntary bar for all other activities. The following year, Speaker Brown took aim directly at the discipline system. The legislative analysis explains why he introduced Assembly Bill 1544.
The proponents argue that the bar's discipline system is unforgiving and heavily biased against practitioners. Basically, they argue that the recently enacted reforms have gone overboard. The bar is driven to produce ever-increasing discipline numbers and statistics at the expense of justice and fair play. The bar harasses hard-working practitioners during the investigative stage of the discipline process and refuses to seriously negotiate settlements prior to filing or trial.
The bill included a 1-year deadline for clients to report attorney misconduct after it is discovered, a 2-year statute of limitations for the bar to file disciplinary charges after receiving a client complaint, as well as other reforms. Speaker Brown's bill was controversial. While it was being debated, a tragedy struck. On July 1, 1993, a former client entered the San Francisco law offices of Pettit and Martin. His 3 blazing guns claimed 9 lives, including his own. 3 days later, State Bar President Harvey Saperstein sprang into action. He thought that lawyer jokes were partly to blame for the tragedy and wanted them to be classified as hate speech. His idea went over about as well as could be expected. 2 months after the shooting, a watered-down version of Speaker Brown's bill passed with almost unanimous approval of the California legislature. It was vetoed by Governor Pete Wilson. The bill never made it into law. In July 1994, the Los Angeles Daily Journal published another investigative series about the discipline system.
In the 5 years since the bar began a sweeping reform of lawyer discipline, California has become a national model. But many problems remain. Consumers often end up madder at the state bar than they were at the lawyer about whom they complained.
The Daily Journal thought that the system had improved because many more lawyers were being disbarred. There had been a 600% increase in disbarments and resignations. But did this mean that the public was really being better protected? According to some discipline defense lawyers, the bar was turning mountains into molehills to satisfy the public demand for more harshness against lawyers.
Important and complicated cases get pushed to the back of the file cabinet, while the number crunchers push easier cases that generate better statistics.
Even some of the state bar court judges seemed to agree. They had dismissed over a quarter of the cases brought to them the year before. This suggests that bar prosecutors were filing many meritless or exaggerated charges. A month after the Daily Journal series, findings were released by a discipline evaluation committee led by federal judge Arthur Alarcon. The Alarcon report recommended streamlining the state bar while still keeping it unified. In the following year, 1995, the Commission on the Future of the Legal Profession and State Bar recommended something very different. It suggested that the State Bar Court should be transferred to the California Supreme Court. There was just one problem with this recommendation. It meant that the Supreme Court would once again need to become more involved with discipline cases. Chief Justice Malcolm Lucas wrote a letter stating, "The court is opposed to such efforts." After that, things did not go well for the State Bar Court. In 1995, Lisa Pearlman's contract as presiding judge came up for renewal. Many people had praised her legal skills, including the Alarcon report.
There are over 100 published review opinions. The quality of these opinions is very high.
Even the normally critical Gert Hirschberg wrote a compliment.
The 3 review department judges are doing an outstanding job.
But all that was not enough to save Judge Pearlman's job. She and 4 other State Bar Court judges did not have their contracts renewed. Miss Pearlman wrote about her experience the following year.
During the first few years of my appointment, I was highly praised by bar leaders for establishing the court's credibility as an independent entity. During the past 2 years, however, the situation began to change. I was vilified by new State Bar board members for defending the very same degree of independence with which the court had started. I was asked by a board member on the Judicial Application Evaluation Committee why I should be recommended for reappointment if I couldn't get along with the board. The following month, I was among 5 of 8 sitting judges who were excluded from a list of nominees. So much for the appearance of judicial independence.
Meanwhile, in October 1995, Governor Pete Wilson signed into law Senate Bill 60. The bill required the State Bar to conduct a new plebiscite of its members to find out if they would still want to keep the unified bar. State Senator Quentin Kopp was the author of the bill. He explains why he introduced it.
It wasn't so much any failure of performance of the State Bar respecting the admission procedures. And that procedure is essentially the State Bar examination. There was some disgruntlement respecting discipline. There was disgruntlement based upon the length of time of any proceeding to finish. And secondly, the laxity or weakness of discipline imposed for conduct. That wasn't so much a glaring cause of at least my discontent, because it's similar to people who claim that a judge hasn't properly adjudicated a sentence for a convicted felon or even a misdemeanor, or sometimes a district attorney isn't pursuing a particular case with avidity and energy and enthusiasm. It was more genuinely the expansion of the State Bar into non-core activity.
Joining Senator Kopp in his battle to abolish the bar was Peter Keene, who is today a professor at the Golden Gate University School of Law. Professor Keene explains why he came to oppose the unified bar.
In the early 1980s, I started getting involved in the local bar association, the Bar Association of San Francisco. I became a member of the board of directors of the Bar Association of San Francisco, and then I got elected president of the Bar Association of San Francisco in the late 80s. And during that time, I had an interchange with lots of people regarding the State Bar of California, and I was involved with a number of activities having to do with the State Bar of California. And it became very apparent to me that the State Bar of California was, at best, a very dysfunctional organization. It was an organization that really didn't fit the roles that it was designed to play. Essentially, the State Bar of California was designed to play 2 roles. It was to be the professional association of lawyers, essentially the lawyers' union, which means they're looking out for lawyers' economic activity, welfare activity, doing all sorts of great things for lawyers. At the same time, it was supposed to police the conduct of lawyers in order to make sure that lawyers acted ethically and didn't do anything to harm the public. So there's a built-in tension in that role in terms of sort of the fox guarding the chicken house. So in the early 90s, I ran for the Board of Governors of the State Bar of California. And I ran for the Board of Governors of the State Bar of California on a very simple platform, and that was to abolish it. And I made that very openly my platform, and I got elected as a governor, member of the State Bar of California, from San Francisco, one of the two governors. And when I was on the Board of Governors, during the 3 years I was on the Board of Governors, in my third year I was vice president of the State Bar of California, I saw an organization really which was indeed dysfunctional and was an enormous bureaucracy, very expensive, which had the staff in its own kind of crystal palace, very high salaries, doing what they wanted to do. At the same time, you had this group called the Board of Governors that supposedly had oversight over the State Bar of California, which was a fiction. All of us were only in for 3 years, and most of the governors spent their first 2 years politicking with the other governors so that they'd get elected president in the third year. So it was all sort of this little don't rock the boat thing, let's everybody be nice and see me as the nicest guy in the world so that you'll elect me president in my third year, and then I can have an extra year as president. I didn't do any of those things. I knew I didn't want to be president, so I didn't have to be involved in that.
Okay, so if everybody would please take your pad of paper and write the name of your vote, the last name, first name of your selection on your pad.
The people who owned it and ran the State Bar really were the executives on the staff, who were giving the marching orders to the people who were the worker bees in the State Bar. And there were some very good people working in regular staff positions on the State Bar to pretty much keep the governors happy, but keep the governors away from seeing anything or getting involved in anything that might have any meaning. So at our meetings, we would get this agenda, and the agenda would be made up by the staff, and it would have all of this crap on it that was just make work. That the governors would be put on a committee, and you're supposed to be doing this, and you'd be doing this, but it was meaningless stuff. It was just like running around in circles, and we'd meet and we'd debate various things, and the stuff we were meeting about and the stuff we were debating about was trivial. And it had nothing to do with the real needs of lawyers, the responsibilities of lawyers to the public, the things that should be done in order to improve the legal profession, and also the things that should be done to help lawyers. So I saw tremendous outlays of money on behalf of various things like retreats for the Board of Governors, sinecures at very expensive places like Napa country clubs. One of the things that amazed me, a little story that kind of amazed me and sort of set the tone for the kind of waste of money that I saw the State Bar of California doing right from the beginning, was that the staff, one of its big functions was to sort of keep the Board of Governors happy, give them whatever they wanted, so they really wouldn't look at what the staff was doing. Whatever they want. You want a party? We'll have a party. You want booze? We'll have booze. You want to do this? You want to travel? We'll have all that. And when I was on the State Bar, after the first meeting that was going to come up, they would meet alternately monthly, 1 month in Los Angeles and 1 month in San Francisco. And the first meeting that was coming up was going to be a San Francisco meeting. And I live in San Francisco, about half a mile from where the State Bar had its headquarters then. And I got a call from this person, clerk at the State Bar, saying, we need to know, would you like us to make your hotel reservations at the Clift Hotel, a very fancy hotel in San Francisco, for Thursday night and Friday night and Saturday night? And I said, why would I want that? So, well, because you're on the Board of Governors. I say, I live in San Francisco, I travel by bus. I'm going to get on the number 5 Fulton bus, put in a quarter, and I'm going to be down at the State Bar building in 15 minutes from my house. So the Clift Hotel is even farther away on the other side. Why would I want to stay there? Well, the reason you want to stay there is because everybody's junketing there for 3 days. 3 nice nights of partying, wonderful time, great rooms, great food, whatever you want. And you bring your wife, and it's a terrific time. I said, no, I don't need that. I live here. I'll get there on my own. I don't need it. And that sort of set the tone for me of this waste of members' money that was done by the staff, not just in regard to sort of keeping the governors happy, but also in regard to huge salaries that many of the staff members had, particularly the executive staff members. Very big salaries. We had one guy who was in charge of the discipline section of the State Bar. He was supposed to be, he was the one who was in charge of all of the investigation and discipline. And his office, when the State Bar moved to Los Angeles, his office was in Los Angeles. Everything that he was doing was in Los Angeles, but he didn't want to move to Los Angeles. So what the State Bar did is he stayed here in San Francisco, and every morning they paid for his flight, and then in the evening back. And this guy had more frequent flyer miles than probably anybody in the country. So those were a couple of sort of emblematic incidents about the State Bar that showed me that it was extremely dysfunctional. So in the late 1990s, a few of us became allied. Mainly, there weren't that many of us, about a half a dozen of us around the state, Quentin Kopp and me, and a few other people, in regard to pushing this plebiscite, the State Bar plebiscite, to cut the bar in half, to make it a voluntary professional association, and all of the other functions, discipline and admissions, those should be turned over to a governmental entity, just like any other governmental entity that runs doctors or any other professions.
Squaring off against Professor Keene was State Bar President James Towery. Mr. Towery issued a dire warning to California lawyers.
What is at stake in this plebiscite is nothing less than the independence and self-regulation of our profession.
But to people like Professor Keene, ending self-regulation was actually a good thing.
The State Bar is a sham, a shell game, one large fraud. It exists for the perpetuation of the officers at the top who run an enormous fiefdom.
In the bar's defense, another group of attorneys formed the Coalition to Save the Unified Bar. The CSUB published a 4-page pamphlet urging a no vote on the plebiscite. They garnered the support of many local bar associations and lawyer groups. Justice Malcolm Lucas wrote,
"The State Bar Court has won national acclaim. Why require the creation from whole cloth of a new system? I believe that the State Bar has served California's legal profession and public well."
51% of California lawyers voted in the plebiscite. 65% of those lawyers voted no, meaning they did not want to break up the bar.
The plebiscite eventually was exercised in terms of voting by only half the members of the State Bar. I think the State Bar probably had 160,000 or so members at the time. And of those half who did vote, the idea that was embodied in my concept was rejected. So the State Bar leaders felt they were vindicated in 1996, but they weren't.
The vote meant that only 1/3 of all lawyers in California cared enough about saving the bar to vote at all. This fact would prove to be significant when a bomb was dropped the following year. The bombardier was Governor Pete Wilson. In November 1997, he vetoed the annual dues bill.
The bar has drifted and become lost, its ultimate mission obscured, commingling its responsibilities and revenues in a manner which creates an almost constant appearance of impropriety. As disgruntled members have leveled charges that the bar is bloated, arrogant, oblivious, and unresponsive, the bar has promptly done its best to verify each indictment.
Governor Wilson aimed most of his criticism at the bar's use of membership funds to promote controversial political causes. But he also had other complaints. He pointed to wastefully high staff salaries. He cited the lobbying scandal when the State Bar entered into a 2-year lobbying contract for $900,000, plus an illegal bonus of $75,000 if he could convince the legislature to pass a multi-year dues bill. Bar leaders appeared so desperate to stay funded that they were willing to break the law to do so. The funding stalemate lasted for a year, and the bar was running out of money. The State Bar's own newspaper, the California Bar Journal, documented the organization's death throes.
The predominant reaction of most California lawyers to the dues impasse is one of apathy. The reality is that most lawyers are unconcerned about the bar's demise.
The fact that only a third of California's lawyers had cared enough to vote to save the bar in the plebiscite could now be seen in a new light. The State Bar was not only unpopular with the public, but it had also become unpopular with the profession. Gert Hirschberg had warned about this trend 8 years earlier.
Most lawyers now think the State Bar is their enemy.
In its October 1998 issue, California Lawyer announced the death of the State Bar.
The nation's preeminent unified bar came to a messy, undignified end. Many of its own members rejoiced. Worse yet, many others didn't care.
In a bit of luck for the State Bar, Governor Wilson's term ended in January 1999. The new governor, Gray Davis, quickly approved a bar dues bill, and the bar was back in business. To bar employees, it was like a phoenix rising from the ashes. To others, it was more like Dracula rising from the coffin. The bar was now able to continue settling into its new headquarters in a building that it had purchased in San Francisco. But this move to 180 Howard Street did not end the controversies. In 1999, State Senator John Burton introduced Senate Bill 143, which required, among other things, that attorneys be guaranteed constitutional protections in disciplinary matters. The legislative analysis explains why Senator Burton thought that such a law was needed.
He reports of numerous complaints from attorneys who have asserted that the State Bar's process and procedures run roughshod over the constitutional and statutory rights of those being investigated for possible discipline.
The new millennium was a time of hope for many people, but critics say that it was business as usual for the State Bar. A confidential report commissioned by the State Bar Board of Governors in 2004 and later made public in a civil lawsuit revealed that bar prosecutors were continuing their practice of overcharging, which means to file meritless or exaggerated disciplinary claims.
The State Bar judges spoke about the tendency of the OCTC to overcharge when preparing the initial notice of disciplinary charges, which often caused problems later in the case.
The problem of overcharging was not always apparent to the public. In 2007, the SF Weekly published an article with more examples of the State Bar not being tough enough on bad lawyers. In 2008, the Board of Governors approved the controversial practice of posting a copy of the notice of disciplinary charges on the State Bar's website, even though the charges were not proven and bar prosecutors had a reputation for overcharging. The new policy also means that client names are made public. This often includes publishing details about a client's case that would otherwise be considered confidential. The year 2009 witnessed another scandal. The bar's director of real property operations, Sharon Pearl, was discovered to have embezzled nearly $700,000 from the State Bar over an 8-year period between 2001 and 2008. She had stolen rent monies paid to the bar by retail tenants in the bar's new San Francisco building. 6 months after criminal charges were filed against Ms. Pearl, the bar was shaken by California's movie star-turned-governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Like Governor Wilson, a decade earlier, Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed the State Bar dues bill. He wrote a message explaining his reasons.
In 1997, Governor Pete Wilson vetoed the annual State Bar dues bill, citing numerous concerns that the State Bar had become overly political, unresponsive to its membership, and inefficient. Unfortunately, 12 years later, inefficiencies remain unaddressed, and questions about the State Bar's role in the evaluation of judicial nominees suggest that the State Bar's political agenda continues. In July, the state auditor released a report critical of the State Bar. Among the problems noted by the report, salaries for staff have risen significantly over the past 5 years. The costs of its disciplinary system have escalated by $12 million from 2004 to 2008, while the number of disciplinary inquiries opened has declined, and a lack of internal controls allowed the embezzlement of nearly $675,000 by a former employee. As the organization charged with regulating the professional conduct of its members, the conduct of the State Bar itself must be above reproach. Regrettably, it is not.
Bar President Howard Miller responded by saying that many of Governor Schwarzenegger's concerns were justified. Would this governor become the destroyer of the State Bar? Well, it was over almost as quickly as it began. A new dues bill was signed just 3 months later, in January 2010. The bar had just survived another near-death experience, but there was still some fallout. The same month, Executive Director Judy Johnson submitted her resignation. The embezzlement had taken place under her watch. Her 2-decade leadership philosophy was simple.
Throw the rascals out. That was the moving force behind the creation of the State Bar in 1927, and it remains a prevailing sentiment today.
Unfortunately, Miss Johnson did not throw out the rascal that was embezzling bar funds right under her nose. In late 2010, the bar once again fell under the scrutiny of Sacramento. The state legislature required the bar to set up an internal study group called the Task Force on Governance in the Public Interest. The task force invited public comment. Professor Felmuth, who had been instrumental in changing the bar almost 2 decades earlier, recommended a breakup of the bar.
It is unethical for a private trade association to engage in the exercise of public police powers, and improper for public officials to purport to run a trade association. The integrated bar can and should be divided. Its trade association functions should be spun off to voluntary trade associations funded with voluntary dollars.
The task force submitted its report on May 11, 2011. The majority of members recommended keeping the unified bar. Only a minority agreed with Professor Felmuth. The legislature went along with majority view. Senate Bill 163 left the bar unified, changed the title Board of Governors to Board of Trustees, and imposed a gradual reduction in the number of board members from 23 to 19. At its July 22, 2011 meeting, the Board of Trustees elected its new president. The 3 candidates discussed lawyer discipline.
The discipline system is, of course, correctly the area of greatest criticism of the bar. There are issues of efficiency, productivity, and accountability that have been singled out to us even before the resignation of our chief trial counsel.
The discipline system, I agree, is dysfunctional. It is about the backlog. The backlog.
At the end of December, we had 1,900 cases in backlog. That, as I pointed out in my report, is inexcusable.
But were backlogs the only problem? Or, as critics charge, is the Board of Trustees continuing to ignore an 800-pound gorilla in the room? Is this group of part-time volunteers blind to the deep problems that seem obvious to so many other people? Professor Richard Zittrain of Hastings Law School wrote in the autumn of 2011.
California's lawyer discipline system has been broken for as long as I can remember. It's long past time to fix it. The highly insular state bar does not like it when lawyers act outside the box, or more accurately, outside their box. It has long been primed to go after people it considers outliers. The state bar as a whole, including the prosecutor's office, has long operated out of fear and self-protection, rather than simply doing what's right for the people of California.
My opinion of the State Bar hasn't modified since the 1990s, since the debate over the plebiscite. I think, though, events have occurred which have sort of brought about some of the things that we were asking for in the plebiscite, and that is that the State Bar, for example, is not as arrogant as it was back in the 80s and the 90s, mainly because I think we humbled them. The fiefdom on the part of the staff that was run in terms of this, the executives of the staff and the board of governors, they became more wary of that being too obvious because of the debate that we brought it out and we kept pushing it in their face. So I can't say that they've modified their conduct as much as I can say is that they're a little more quiet about it, and they do it underneath the radar now. Whereas before, the idea that that the executives of the State Bar of California, the Board of Governors of the State Bar of California, would react to any criticism of it or be tempered by any criticisms of it, they would just blow it off. Now, they've been hit so many times by criticisms and by things that endanger them, like us almost breaking it up during that plebiscite vote, that they're very wary now. And they do things in a very low-key way. And they try and come forward. They try their best to put a good face on the fact that, yes, we are indeed fulfilling our role of disciplining of lawyers and making sure that the legal profession does the right thing. And to some extent, they have improved in that area. To the extent that the State Bar back in the 80s and the 90s was still a very dysfunctional bureaucracy, mainly engaged in perpetuating its own bureaucratic existence. That's still true today.
We interviewed attorneys who had been disciplined by the State Bar to get an inside view of the system. They are the forgotten voices. Their often shocking stories may be the strongest testimony yet why change is desperately needed for the sake of the public and the quality of justice in California. Meet Patricia Barry. She is a legal pioneer who is best known for her landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Meritor Savings Bank versus Vinson, that helped to make the American workplace safer from sexual harassment.
I've fought very, very hard for women's rights and workers' rights, victims of civil rights violations, African American and Latino rights, minority worker rights. And I just can't believe that the State Bar did what it's done to me.
Patricia's first encounter with the State Bar discipline system happened just over a decade ago. She was representing a battered mother in Marin County who was trying to gain custody of her abused daughter.
The judge in the case, Verna Adams, was extraordinarily controversial. There was a lot of adverse publicity against her as a family law attorney in Marin County. She was associated with this very corrupt family law judge named Duffy. And what came out of the newspapers was that there was this elite group of family law practitioners. It was FLIA, which I think was a Freudian slip, because they are fleas in my estimation. It was family law elite attorneys, and they hung around with Duffy, and there was a newspaper report that they would go out and party at his ranch. Apparently he was very wealthy. And Verna Adams was among this elite group, and she was appointed to the bench where she proceeded to make everybody's battered women's lives miserable. I got into different issues with the judge, and then she kept calling me in contempt. You're in contempt. You're in contempt. You're in contempt. Every time I opened up my mouth, I was in contempt. So then Judge Adams referred me to the state bar. A guy named Jerome Craig from Morrison and Forster calls and said, "Oh, I'm a special prosecutor."
The state bar retained an outside prosecutor because Patricia had once sued the state bar in the public interest.
And I said, "You don't have any right." I said, You're my opponent in court. Morrison Forster has a huge, you're a big corporate law firm, and you have a big, huge employment defense law firm. You'd love to put me out of business." I try to correspond with him, and I don't hear from him for months. Then about 7 months later, he says, "Give me all your paperwork." I said, "Okay." Then I don't hear from him for 2 years. So the statute's about to run if the state bar ever decides to follow their own statute of limitations. It's now 4.5 years. And of course, I never got found in contempt again. It's now 4.5 years since the bar referral was made. So in any event, I then began doing research on Morrison and Forster. And they had a number of significant cases just looking at Los Angeles Superior Court. I didn't even go to the big, San Francisco, which is their main office. I just looked at LA. And they were getting sued quite a bit. And I saw one of them being worth bar discipline. It was a severe fee gouging against a tiny little corporation.
In 2005, Patricia reached an agreement with the Morrison and Forster prosecutor. They agreed that she would receive a private reproval. That reproval, however, came with conditions. One condition was that Patricia had to take the Multi-State Professional Responsibility Exam, the MPRE. The MPRE is a common requirement when any kind of discipline short of disbarment is imposed on an attorney. Failing to pass can lead to further discipline.
And so here the state bar continues to come after me for not, it wasn't that I didn't take it. They're saying because you failed it, you're guilty of misconduct. I said, "What'd you think? I sabotaged it?"
While Patricia was dealing with the state bar in regard to the MPRE, she had begun to represent some whistleblowers from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power.
There's a lot happening today at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and today I have with me Patricia Berry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve.
I understand that you represent maybe 7 or 8 whistleblowers at the DWP?
Correct.
Would it be safe to say that the Empire at that time was making a lot of money?
Oh, they made millions.
Providing inferior products.
Correct.
And it cost the city a lot more money than they would have had they gone through the proper channels.
Right.
Patricia's clients had been fired after revealing the Empire janitorial services were overcharging the city and providing inferior products. During a 2007 video interview, Patricia criticized Los Angeles City Controller Laura Chick for not doing an audit of the city's transactions with Empire. As it turned out, Laura Chick was also on the State Bar Board of Governors. Coincidentally, 3 weeks after the interview, Patricia was told that the State Bar was launching another discipline action against her in regard to a family law case. The bar did not recuse itself, despite an appearance of possible retaliatory prosecution for the video interview.
Brandon Tatey, State Bar prosecutor, says, "Oh, by the way, we're going to prosecute you on the Darla Elwood case." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" He said, "Oh, well, you filed frivolous actions. You're guilty of moral turpitude." So I looked up the definition of moral turpitude. I'm akin to a criminal. I could be, they put me in the same category as an axe murderer. And and I couldn't figure out why they were resurrecting. I said, "Those complaints are over the 5-year statute of limitations." "Oh, no, you took an appeal, so too bad, so sad." And I said, "Well, who's complaining?" And they said, Joseph Morin. Joseph Morin is a batterer. He's a violent man. What are you representing him for? I thought the bar was active in opposing domestic violence. I can get you all the evidence that I have.
Patricia was representing another battered mother trying to get custody of a child. After the family court had awarded custody to the father, Patricia took the novel step of bringing the matter into the federal court and framing it as a civil rights issue. The federal court, however, ruled that some of the federal claims were frivolous. Because of this, the State Bar decided to discipline Patricia.
Well, what was crazy is that some of the causes of action ultimately were called frivolous, even in the face of one court of appeals saying that there was merit to the appeal and I had a right to go forward. It was all confusing. It was very problematic, the case in itself, on this issue of frivolousness. Like, how could I know? I was supposed to know that when I did it, I was just a wicked little attorney who didn't do her research. And as Darla Elwood or anybody who knows me will attest, I don't do anything without trying to find the answer through legal research first.
Patricia was faced with going to trial in state bar court, which would have disrupted important work that she was doing on another case. So in March 2010, she signed a document called a Stipulation Re Fax, Conclusions of Law. Patricia told us that she disagreed with many statements in the stipulation, but she could not afford to go through with a fight. She agreed to a 60-day actual suspension. Part of the discipline was based on the fact that Patricia had not passed the MPRE, even though she had tried.
I believe it's no coincidence that they prosecuted me on 2 cases involving battered women trying to regain custody of their daughters, who they allege were being severely abused by the fathers. And they ended up both being correct. Carol Mardus now has her daughter severely abused by the father, now that she's an adult. And in Darla Elwood's case, the daughter that we said, don't listen to her, she's being terrorized by the father. Anything she has to say is because of his threats of punishment. Sure enough, she got up her nerve at age 15, and the last I heard was that she refused to go home, says, I hate him, and he's been abusing me for ever since I've been forced to live with him. This is the man that the state bar has championed as being a victim of my litigation. The judges gave him a pass and allowed him to retain custody. Now the state bar, of course he felt empowered to keep beating on that girl.
Patricia regretted her settlement with the bar prosecutors. 2 months after signing the stipulation, she asked the state bar court to set it aside and to receive a jury trial. Her request to set aside the stipulation was denied, and the state bar does not allow jury trials in discipline matters.
What they do is they jam the charges, like they do with a criminal defense attorney, and you get so scared that your bar card, and this is all you've ever known, is going to be taken from you, so you plead out to one of their nonsense defamatory stips that include acts or a description of your conduct based on the Code of Professional Responsibility that's like in La La Land. You said, I did that.
Later that year, the state bar sent Patricia a bill for her prosecution.
The U.S. Supreme Court and federal courts as well as state courts have held that when an attorney is litigating civil rights, you've got to give them wide berth because they are private attorney general. We have been deputized, my client and me, and attorneys are recognized for pushing forward the boundaries of civil rights law. State bar didn't care about any of those legal principles. None.
Most fathers are good, loving parents. Jim Kohler was a trailblazing attorney who had helped to bring the fathers' rights movement into the family courts of California and the country. He became involved in 1980 when California passed the nation's first joint custody statute. Jim won custody of his own son, and the publicity caused other fathers to beat a path to his office door. Jim fondly remembers an event in 1981 when he was the only lawyer to attend a Texas meeting that would evolve into the National Congress for Fathers and Children.
The manager of the hotel asked me to come to his office one afternoon and said he had a telegram. And would I accept it on behalf of the father's rights? And I said, sure, of course I'll accept it. Yeah, no problem. Well, this was from a Dr. Karen DeCrow. And she was the president of the National Organization for Women. And she said to us, in this thing, it said, welcome to the civil rights movement. We helped guys all over the country, fathers' rights, set up in their own towns. That's the first thing. Second thing, James Cook and I and some others took the concept of joint custody, and we got it passed in 37 legislatures. So joint custody became the norm.
Despite his success, Jim's relationship with the California State Bar was on shaky ground. He had already received a public approval in 1976 before his involvement in the Fathers' Rights movement. A reproval is considered very light discipline, but his father's rights activity began to fuel a backlash.
This movement, bringing fathers and their children back together, spread like the proverbial wildfire. But it came with a cost, and it was a hidden cost. And the cost was that there was an offshoot of the feminist movement. Now, it wasn't the original movement that we got that telegram from Dr. DeCrow. It wasn't the feminists who were genuinely interested in moving women's issues forward. It was a different group. It was saying about a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And that culture seeped right into the state bar. I didn't realize it, really, at the time. But people began to warn me. And finally, my own lawyer had to go to the chief trial counsel in the early 90s and say, stop targeting Mr. Kohler. Take him off your radar screen, because the women prosecutors were actually taking my clients to lunch, trying to dummy up complaints.
Jim was disciplined again in 1992. This time he received a 6-month actual suspension. One charge stated that he had failed to perform in a timely way for a client.
Various of the men that I would send out on cases hadn't quite done their job right. And I was their supervisor. And there's a rule that says, well, if you're the supervisor, you're responsible for them. And a couple of these men had failed to do things. The irony is that one of those guys turned out to be later a family law commissioner.
He was also accused of commingling funds by placing some of his own money into his client trust account to help his clients.
Actually, the clients gained because my habit in those days was to take in about $300 for their costs. Well, clients' costs often went way out beyond that. Boom, 500. Well, rather than keep hounding them on each tiny little thing to put it in, I just threw in my own money and used my own money for them.
It was not long before the State Bar went after Jim again. He was charged with improperly withdrawing from a client case. This resulted in a 60-day actual suspension in 1999.
I represented a doctor, but a doctor who had a brain tumor. I loved him dearly, marvelous guy, but his brain tumor made him very erratic. And we were once again going after custody of his children, his teenage daughters. And he was a wonderful father. He was their softball coach and all sorts of things. And I wanted to take it up on appeal, make a test case out of it. And he didn't want to spend the money to do it. So, okay, fine, no problem. I gave him back all the advance money, and they wrote up a substitution of attorneys. We both signed it. Well, then I made a mistake. I entrusted him with the original to file, because we did it over a weekend. And instead of filing it, he threw it away. And then he went to court and said, well, where's Mr. Kohler? Mr. Kohler's not here. Oh, my goodness.
During the 2-month suspension, Jim worked as a paralegal for another lawyer. This is something that suspended lawyers are permitted to do. Jim's new boss took over one of Jim's custody cases that involved a young military airman who was being denied child visitation by the mother. Jim remained active in the case as the new attorney's paralegal. When Jim's suspension ended, He went back to being the young airman's attorney of record for several more years.
When the case was all over, and I had won it for this guy, he and his mother didn't want to pay the bill, so I had to sue him.
The client's wealthy mother had promised to pay her son's legal bill.
And they had a lot of money, like $25 million. So they had his mother, he didn't, but his mother had millions. And rather than pay the bill, they hired a lawyer who dug into the case, found this obscure facts, took it to the bar, and lobbied the bar ferociously over the period of 2 years to finally file charges.
Jim and his disciplined defense lawyer spent 2 weeks in trial before Judge Richard Hahn. On August 10, 2009, Judge Hahn filed a decision stating that Jim had engaged in the unauthorized practice of law because of what Jim had written as a paralegal in one letter and a note. By the time of Judge Hahn's decision, nearly 10 years had passed since Jim had written those things. Judge Hahn recommended that Jim be disbarred, even though Jim's handling of the custody case had greatly improved the client's circumstances.
During this 2 weeks that I spent with Richard Hahn, what lies behind my being nice, being kindly, liking him, frankly, is that, yes, he very much talked, found a complete understanding of how the clients had tried to manipulate this. Both my lawyer and I were totally shocked when this decision came out that really was a total disconnect from the evidence. In other words, it was as if the trial had never occurred. And this was just some kind of a cookie cutter decision that didn't really take into account the true facts of it. I think it's purely the fact there is just incredible pressure on the hearing department judges to find culpable every single lawyer that comes before them. And I think you have to stand one step back and realize that this is not an elected judge. He's appointed. His salary is paid by the state bar, by the treasurer of the state bar. And he makes money for the state bar every culpable case that he finds. So I then filed for review. That was a very, very unpleasant experience because those three women review department judges open fired on me from the beginning in probably the most hostile way you can imagine. I mean, the general tenor was, how dare you appeal this because you're guilty and all that's left is the hanging.
On September 17, 2010, the review department upheld Judge Hahn's recommendation. The California Supreme Court would not grant review and ordered Jim's disbarment. To most observers, Jim's letter and note seemed trivial, especially since Jim was working under the supervision of an attorney. But the unlicensed practice of law, known as UPL, is considered by the bar to be moral turpitude. Judge Hahn and the review department also invoked Standard 1.7, the 3 strikes rule. It did not matter that all of Jim's strikes had been mild and were spread out over a long and distinguished career. Just the fact that there were 3 priors gave the bar a reason to take away Jim's law license. That was how the state bar ended the career of a legal maverick who had helped blaze a path of greater gender equality in the family courts of California and the nation. This was good news for the state bar. It could show another disbarment statistic to the legislature and send out another large bill.
I wanted to leave the law. I was done with it. It left such a sickening feeling. It still actually kind of does when I think about it. I've lost absolute respect for the bar.
Justin Gingery is a Northern California lawyer who also got into trouble for the unauthorized practice of law, but under very different circumstances. Fresh out of law school in 1999, Justin opened his own law office. His rapid success did not earn him a cover story as a Lawyer of the Year. Instead, it led to his own nightmare with the state bar.
I had just started out on my own practice. I was doing actually very well with the amount of business I was bringing in due to the nature of my dad's relationship with physical therapists and chiropractors. My dad was a very famous softball player in the area, and softball players use chiropractors and physical therapists all the time. His team won the national championship 5 years in a row and was actually broken up by the ASA because they were considered a monopoly. So they were very, 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 very popular team. Needless to say, I hired my dad to come work with me as he had worked with law firms for about 20 years. And he's sort of a rainmaker in that way, kind of like Danny DeVito in the movie The Rainmaker. And so along with my dad comes referrals. Needless to say, out of a year out of law school and practicing law, I was bringing in a substantial amount of business. It raised the attention of State Farm, the insurance company, who noticed that I was doing a high volume of business in a very short period of time, and assumed that I was running a running and capping scheme, which basically is insurance code for paying medical providers for referrals. So needless to say, they teamed up with the Insurance Commission and the District Attorney of Butte County, which is where my offices were headquartered in Chico, California at the time. And in June of 2002, June 19th to be exact, they ran a 13-site raid in cooperation with the Yolo County and Yuba County, because I had offices in those locations too. They raided my offices, they raided my personal home, they raided my dad's home, they raided my brother's home, who was also an employee of mine. And basically took everything, brought my entire practice to a halt. They took all of my computers. So everything came to a scratching halt. I was able to get a special discovery master appointed that day when they were in there to prevent them from taking my files, but they were going to take my client files also. After 6 months of battling with the Butte County District Attorney's Office, I was able to get my computers back and start business again. The only thing I got indication from the Insurance Commission and the Butte County District Attorney's Office was that they didn't have enough information to make a single arrest. So no arrest came of it. I thought I was in the clear. I did nothing wrong, so I was not afraid. About a year later, 2003, right about the same time, June, I got a letter from the bar saying that they were put on notice by the Insurance Commission as well as the Butte County District Attorney's Office that I was up to no good. And even though they did not have enough information to make a criminal prosecution of it, they thought that the bar would be very interested in whatever they might be able to find. The bar wanted me to disclose everything to them. I didn't retain an attorney at the time because, I didn't think I had anything to hide. I responded to the request from the bar with a very lengthy letter of my own, giving them access to everything they asked for, my bank accounts, my trust account. I even let them access to my client files. Whatever they wanted to see, they were more than welcome to come in and get. And they did. And I kept doing business as usual. 3 years later, 2006, I finally get a letter from the investigator. His name escapes me at this time. But that they found a discrepancy in my trust account. And the moment they brought it to my attention, I knew exactly what they were talking about. When I first started, my trust account was through a bank that I was getting my return checks that were written out to House to Home and Home Base and other these places, obviously, where trust account funds would not be going. So somebody was taking my routing number and placing it on their personal checks and writing checks out of my trust account. Thought I was going to get in trouble with the bar with that. So even though I brought it to the bank's attention on 3 different occasions, I didn't do what I should have done now in retrospect. I just should have opened up another trust account. But instead, my quick answer was, I took my client's lien money. I wrote my client the check right out of the trust account. But the lien money that they owed to doctors and the medical professionals that provided their care that was still owed, I transferred that money into my general and wrote the check out of there, so that those funds wouldn't be compromised by whoever was pilfering my account at the time. What the bank told me was it was an employee, and that employee was summarily terminated, but I never got the identity of who. And they refunded all the money. I mean, the bank was very good about that. And when these checks that were obviously written by somebody else with somebody else's signature just had my routing number on it. I mean, it was their own personal checks. So this person wasn't that smart of a criminal anyway. They returned all that money, but I was afraid that one of those checks would get cashed wherever it was going, and that fund was supposed to be due to some doctor. So at that point in time, I knew it was time to get an attorney, and I did. Well, I sat down with counsel, and counsel explained to me that, look, this is a 90-day automatic suspension, and even though the bar is willing to admit that you didn't take any money from your clients, that all bills were paid, that no harm was caused, it doesn't matter. You commingled funds 90 days, period. If you want to fight it, it's going to cost you anywhere between $60,000 to $80,000 to take this to trial. You are going to lose, at least on that issue. They're bringing other issues to your attention, namely that my father was practicing law without a license, UPL as they call it. And so as an extra addition to my automatic 90 days that I was going to get for the trust account commingling, they threw on unauthorized practice of law or failure to supervise the unauthorized practice of law, which is what they wanted to add that on to my stipulation. I didn't want it, but at the same time, again, my options were to fight it. It was going to cost me $68,000, is what my attorney was quoting me. So I decided to sign the stipulation after meeting with my partners and my dad and everybody that was involved to see that it was okay. What I didn't know at the time is that the stipulation was setting me up for them to come in again. But anyway, I signed that and did my 90 days. I came back from my 90-day suspension to find out that my partners who had agreed to make the necessary adjustments to the manner in which we ran the office, in other words, changed the dynamic of my father's position. In other words, he was not allowed to talk to clients, insurance adjusters. In fact, he was not supposed to be on the phone at all. My dad was a liability. In fact, my suggestion was to just fire him. Even though he was my father, I had fired my brother before, so I was okay with letting family members go according to my own practice. The partners weren't going to fire my brother, or my dad rather, and so I lost. And since I was without a license at the time, because we had this meeting during my suspension, and all my files had been transferred over to my partners under 9.20 of what I had to do for compliance, and I'm not allowed to have any clients in my name or files in my name. They had all the control. Needless to say, they decided to keep my dad on. They fired me, and I was done. At least so I thought. I started up working for a boutique firm in Walnut Creek, doing something completely unrelated to personal injury, trying to get my life in a whole other direction. I was actually seriously considering leaving the law, tried a couple of times, realized that once you have a graduate degree that's specialized in the law, it's very hard to get out of the pigeonhole that you find yourself in without having to go back to school, which I didn't have the luxury of doing since I was now involved with the family. So I'm working with a small firm out of Walnut Creek, commuting from Sacramento, and I get another letter from the bar saying that a particular client has complained and looked up on the bar and found out that I had been disciplined for my dad's unauthorized practice of law and that similar things were going on in the office again. I didn't know it was going to come back to haunt me, though, and the bar drugged me back in because there was this window of time from when I signed my first stipulation to when I finally left the firm. And there was a buyout agreement and everything, and it took 3 months for it to come into effect. But in that window of time, I was held responsible for the fact that my dad was still working at the firm doing what he was doing. My partners signed a stipulation saying that they didn't know my dad was working there, didn't know anything about my discipline, and didn't know anything. They completely lied, did under penalty of perjury as if they didn't even care. I went to my same attorney because he knew everything. He said we could fight this. He was incensed. He wanted to fight it. He even cut me a deal This time I actually spent more money than I could. I spent all my savings. I depleted my funds. He cut me a great deal, and I'm forever grateful to my attorney for that. But needless to say, once my partner signed a stipulation that was completely contrary to mine, I was the liar. It was 2 against 1 again, and it was kind of like that position when the firm was taken from me, which was my firm. So against his better wishes and even against mine, my attorney says, you're going to get nailed on this. The judge at the time that we were doing our mandatory settlement conferences, and we were probably about a month from trial, was saying the same thing. Look, I'm not saying that this is right. I'm not saying that this is fair, but you're going to get disciplined. My understanding is if you've been twice disciplined by the bar, your second discipline has to equal your first discipline, if not more. They were actually offering me 180 days. And they wanted me to sign off on that I committed moral turpitude because they were alleging that I lied to them in my original stipulation. Those were 2, especially the moral turpitude issue, was an issue I was never going to bend on. I was going to fight it tooth and nail, and if I had to go broke, I'd do it. So, it's been a while since I taught about this, so sorry. After a lot of fighting, a lot of crying, I got them to drop the moral turpitude issue. And so it was a small moral victory for me, but it was enough to know that I know I did the right thing. The only thing I'd done throughout the entire time was tell the truth and let everybody have access to whatever was needed. I cooperated with the bar on every level that I possibly could. Although that didn't seem to be a mitigating factor when it became important. Unfortunately, I mean, they have it drafted up in your stipulation, mitigating factors, cooperate with the bar, but they never seem to ever check that box. So I signed a second stipulation to 120 days, up against the wall, financially broke, and just happy that I didn't have to sign off on moral turpitude for the rest of my life. I don't know if $60,000 was worth not having moral turpitude on my record. I think in the end it will be. I think when it's finally said and done, I can still hang my head high and say I did what I wanted to do when I did this, which is I was honest. Not through discipline, but through my life, through this profession. Part of my discipline, I've had to attend ethics school through the bar every time. I've had to retake the MPRE every time. And the ethics school is really kind of interesting because they sit you down with the man, and I've had the same teacher twice, both in 2006 and both just last year when I had to retake this school. And he said something at both times, that the bar has a reputation for picking on the sole proprietors because they don't go for any of the big firms. And it doesn't mean that the big firms aren't doing what the little guys are doing. It's just that the little guys are easier to get. And he even asked, how many here are sole proprietors or work in firms with 3 or less attorneys? Everybody in the room raised their hand. And there was 50 of us. And just this last one, they did the same thing. He asked the same question. Everybody raised their hand but me. And the reason why I didn't raise my hand is because currently I'm working in a firm with larger than 3 attorneys, because that's where I had to come and run and hide. The bar knows that they pick on the little guy because they know in the end the money hurts the little guy. It is the financial issue that pushes them to stipulate and settle. It is a lot more difficult for a sole proprietor to afford a 6-figure hit to defend himself than it is some big multi-million-dollar firm to afford that hit. And they know that, and they absolutely take advantage. I'm not even exaggerating. Every person in that room raised their hand. Both times I've been through that ethics class. That's their concentration, and they know it. And he even said it. The instructor even said it. We have a reputation for doing it, and I'm just curious. And he asked the question, and everybody raised their hand. And to me, it just dawned on me, I got it. And I get it. You know you're doing it, and you do it anyway.
Justin's allegation is not new. The state bar discipline system has often been accused of discriminating against lawyers who are in solo practice or small firms. In 1994, the Alarcon Report tried to tackle this controversy. The committee concluded that there was no evidence of selective prosecution. The committee randomly surveyed the bar's intake unit, which receives and analyzes complaints against lawyers when they first reach the bar. During a random 5-month period surveyed by the Alarcon Committee, 69% of complaint calls were about sole practitioners, 23% involved firms of 2 to 5 attorneys, 4% were about firms of 6 to 50 attorneys, and 4% involved firms of 51 or more. During the same survey period, 55% of actions were against sole lawyers, 29% against firms of 2 to 5 attorneys, and 16% against lawyers in firms of 6 or more. At first glance, it appears that the bar was actually being easier on sole practitioners than on large firm lawyers. However, it is well recognized that sole practitioners get a higher percentage of legally unsophisticated clients with unrealistic expectations that result in more bar complaints. Significantly, the report failed to state what it meant by actions. Did that simply mean forwarding a complaint from the intake unit to the investigation unit? Did it mean filing disciplinary charges? Did it mean imposing actual discipline? If the action statistic in the Alarcon report meant actual discipline, then it is expected that at least a third of the students in Justin Gingery's State Bar ethics classes would have come from law firms of 4 or more attorneys, but none of them were. The Alarcon report had not put the controversy to rest. 5 years later, State Senator Burton introduced Senate Bill 143, which required the bar to conduct a new internal study to determine if it was unfairly targeting solo and small firm lawyers. The bar hired an outside consulting firm to perform the statistical analysis. Hilton, Farncoff, and Hobson, better known as HF&H. The final report was released in June 2001. The State Bar concluded that it had no institutional bias against solo practitioners and small firm attorneys. But the Bar's report was quickly criticized. HF&H had been hired to, quote, perform a statistical study of the data gathered by the State Bar, unquote. HF&H only used data fed to it by the State Bar. Secondly, why did the bar hire a firm that specializes in waste management consulting? The study looked at the number of cases that went from the intake unit to full investigation and compared that to the number of cases that went from full investigation to actual prosecution. Contrary to the bar's conclusion, the actual numbers seem to reveal a strong bias against solo and small firm lawyers. After leaving the intake unit, almost every investigation of a sole practitioner resulted in a prosecution, but only half the lawyers in large firms were prosecuted. Neither the Alarcon report nor the Bar study compared the severity of discipline imposed against lawyers in differently sized law practices. Are lawyers in large firms or who have friends in the State Bar dealt with less severely? One well-publicized case in 2010 seems to show that. The Los Angeles office of Girardi Keese has long enjoyed a reputation as one of California's preeminent firms. One of its partners, Howard Miller, became the State Bar president in 2009. At the State Bar's annual convention in 2010, Girardi Keese sponsored an appearance of the Los Angeles Lawyers Philharmonic Orchestra and singer Paul Anka to entertain California Supreme Court Chief Justice Ronald George and other guests. By that time, Girardi Keese was hanging under a cloud of trouble. It had associated with the firm of Engstrom, Lipscomb, and Lack in a lawsuit against several major corporations in Nicaragua, including the Dole Food Company. This group of lawyers obtained a default judgment in the amount of $489 million. There was just one catch. The lawsuit did not use the correct company name for Dole, so the lawyers submitted a false declaration to make the U.S. federal court think that the Nicaraguan order did show the correct name. The federal court system conducts its own lawyer discipline separate from the states. The federal court disciplined 3 of the lawyers Thomas Girardi was publicly reprimanded. Walter F. Lack and Paul Traina were suspended from practice in the federal courts for 6 months. Howard Miller had also been named in the federal disciplinary charges, but the charges against him were later dropped. The federal discipline order was issued on July 13, 2010, just 2 months before the Paul Anka concert. Now it was up to the California State Bar to decide if these lawyers should also be disciplined at the state level. This is usually done when there is serious ethical misconduct in the federal courts. The State Bar Prosecutor's Office, headed by former bar president James Towery, decided that it had a conflict of interest trying to prosecute a member of the State Bar president's own firm. A special outside prosecutor would be needed. There were over 200,000 lawyers in California to choose from, but the bar chose attorney Jerome Falk of the San Francisco firm of Howard Rice. That appointment raised some eyebrows. A partner in Howard Rice was Douglas Winthrop. Winthrop was serving at the time on the board of directors of the California Bar Foundation with, among others, Thomas Girardi. Could a lawyer from Howard Rice really be objective under these circumstances? The California Bar Foundation is a nonprofit corporation operated by the State Bar. The foundation is financed by private donations, mostly from lawyers. It promotes diversity and equal access to the law. The foundation's 2010 annual report further reveals that Douglas Winthrop of Howard Rice was president of the foundation that year at the same time that Howard Miller of Girardi Keys was sponsoring a foundation scholarship. Both were major donors to the foundation. William Hebert took over as State Bar president in the fall of 2010, when the Girardi-Lack discipline matter was still pending in the State Bar system. Hebert was also involved in the foundation that year and praised its good works.
The foundation continues to play a critical role in addressing the deepest cracks in the justice gap.
State Bar Executive Director Judy Johnson was also a friend of the foundation.
The foundation is uniquely positioned to make a real difference in closing the justice gap. I'm proud to be a longtime supporter.
But were the State Bar President and Executive Director perpetuating a justice gap in the State Bar's own discipline system? Given all of these circumstances, few people were surprised when the special prosecutor from Howard Rice decided that Thomas Girardi and his lawyer friends in the Dole litigation should not be publicly disciplined by the State Bar. State Bar officials were satisfied with this decision, and the California Supreme Court under Ronald George did nothing. All of this inspired David Carr, a former State Bar prosecutor turned discipline defense lawyer, to write in his blog.
It's hard to escape the troubling thought that had Mr. Girardi and Mr. Lack been different lawyers with no connection to the State Bar, like Howard Miller, the process and perhaps even the result would have been much different.
We compared the Girardi State Bar discipline case to the second discipline of sole practitioner Patricia Berry. The Girardi and Berry cases both arose from conduct in the federal court. Patricia is not involved in the State Bar Foundation, and she has never hired Paul Anka to serenade the California Chief Justice. Patricia was never disciplined by the federal court. Girardi, Lack, and Traina were. Patricia was trying to prevent a child from being abused. Girardi, Lack, and Traina were associated with an attempt to perpetrate a $489 million fraud on the federal court. Yet, Patricia was publicly disciplined by the State Bar and received a strike against her under the bar's 3 strikes rule. Girardi, Lack, and Traina were not publicly disciplined by the State Bar and received no strikes against them.
The bar picks and chooses, and it seems to me that the ethical attorneys are the ones taking the beating, and those that maintain this corrupt system of cronyism, money being the end-all and be-all, and routine violation of our Code of Professional Responsibility are the victors in this case. And something has to be done about this.